When all the leaves start to fall, it means it's time to get serious and bring out the big blower because that little handheld isn't going to cut it. However, things don't always come out of long-term storage the way we want them to. That's the case with this blower, and when you see what's wrong with it, it'll make you realize that even the smallest of issues can cause big problems, and the alternative is something that most people want to avoid. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this mid-sized backpack blower, and the problem is that sometimes it has a problem starting. And if you hadn't figured it out, the sometimes part is the big clue as to what's wrong with it. It won't make sense right now, but by the end of the video, it hopefully will. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, this blower's had a tough life in the last 10 or 11 years. It hasn't been abused, but it wasn't taken care of like it should have been, and to be honest, you can't really blame them. Now, besides the throttle handle not being attached to the blower tube, the airbox has seen better days as well. Of course, I'm not going to worry too much about these two items at the moment because we have a bigger problem. Now, as you can see, while I was checking to see why the air filter cover was loose, it would seem that the rest of the intake system is loose as well. And not only that, but there's also a lot of dirt covering the carb as well as other parts of the blower, which would mean that we have a pretty serious leak on our hands. Now, for those of you who don't know, an air leak in the intake system is very detrimental to a fuel system that has a carb on it. Now, an air leak before the carb isn't as bad, but one after the carb will have a huge impact on the engine. Now, before we jump to conclusions, I'd like to get a better look at the air filter cover and see why all this tape is even here. At first, I thought this was duct tape, but turns out to be something much different. So if you know what kind of tape this is, I'd like to know about it because it seems to be doing a pretty good job. Now, surprisingly, the bolt on the back of the knob doesn't have any sort of damage to it. So now I have to wonder if the nut that's in the airbox might be the part that's damaged. However, on closer inspection, it looks to be in perfect condition as well. So if there's no damage to either part, why use tape to hold the cover on then? So I ended up calling my friend who owns this blower to ask them about the tape, and come to find out, they were just having a tough time getting the bolt to grab the nut. So they resorted to using tape thinking there was something wrong with it. But later on, you're going to see that there was nothing wrong with it, and it just takes a little bit of effort to make it grab. Now, after getting to the two bolts that hold the airbox and the carb to the insulator, turns out they were barely loose. However, that doesn't explain why the entire intake system is moving as much as it is. That must mean the loose bolts must be on the insulator on the engine, which means we'll have to dig a little deeper to get to them. So after seeing all that dirt and oil on the carb and the rest of the blower, I'm going to give it a quick cleaning for obvious reasons. And to be honest, by the way this blower looks, it probably hasn't been cleaned in the last decade. So is it really necessary to clean your blower off? Well, the short answer is yes. In fact, for this blower, it's the first item under the maintenance section in the owner's manual. I'm not sure when it became the cool thing to do to ignore the owner's manual for your equipment, but if you want your stuff to last long enough to make it worth the price, I'd recommend glancing at it at least once. Now, to help take off the residue from that tape, I'm using WD-40 to help soften it, but I'm sure there are other solvents out there that would work just as well. Now, I've cleaned as much as I can for the moment, and everything after this will take us closer to the carb. So before I get too far into this process, I'm going to let the blower dry off, that way I can keep water from getting inside the engine. Of course, if you wanted to, you could use some compressed air or even another leaf blower to help dry it off faster. Now, there is one other thing I want to check on while we're here, but I'm not going to deal with it until we fix the intake. Now, to make filming what I'm doing a bit easier, I'm going to take the rear cover off the engine, but it's not necessary, and you'll see why here in a bit. So with the cover out of the way, it's now much easier to see what's going on with the intake system. So as you can see, the movement in the intake goes all the way back to the engine, which means there's a good chance that there's also an air leak between the carb and the engine. Also, while I have this chance, I'm going to inspect the carb for any issues, but it's only as a precaution. However, if we do see something wrong with the carb, this would be a great time to fix it, if not replace it with a new carb. Also, this would be a great time to service the carb, whether it needed it or not, but I really don't like to mess with stuff that's already working the way that it should be. Remember, the problem with this blower was that it was sometimes difficult to start. However, when it did start, it was working just like it should be, with no other issues worth mentioning. So here's the carb, and the most notable thing about it is that it's very dirty, and that's because of the air leak also leaking some fuel, which is what dirt loves to get stuck to. Unfortunately, the cleaning I did earlier didn't do a very good job, so I'll have to do it now, since I don't want to get any of this dirt inside the carb when I take it apart. And thanks to that degreaser I'm using, it's now a lot cleaner, so now we can start our inspection of the carb, but I'm going to do something a bit different. I know this type of carb is supposed to be an improved version of the older flap style carbs, but sometimes these can be a bit stubborn to take apart. Now everything on this carb is on one side of the carb. You don't need to take the other end apart unless you want to take a look at the barrel. So this is the metering diaphragm, and its job is to control fuel flow through the carb. Now to do that, it has to be very flexible, which as you can see it is, but if it's not flexible, it'll cause the engine to not work at different speeds. Now this one is almost in perfect condition, so I will not be replacing it. Next, I want to get a better look at the pumping diaphragm, which is under this section of the carb. The problem is that sometimes the gasket for the diaphragm will get stuck, and taking it off could damage it, and if that happens, I'll have to buy a rebuild kit, which could take a couple of days. So to avoid that, I'm going to take a peek at it, but I'm not going to take it off the body of the carb. I know it was tough to see, but I didn't see anything with the pumping diaphragm that would have me worried about it. Which makes sense because, like I said earlier, I didn't think the carb was the issue, but I still had to check. I'm also going to take this opportunity to replace the purge bulb, but to be honest, the one that was on there was holding up very well. But since these bulbs are not very expensive, changing it makes sense because I don't want this blower to come back anytime soon. However, I may have spoken a bit too soon, as you'll see here in a bit. So this is the insulator between the carb and the engine. And after checking the bolts, well, it turns out 2 of the 4 bolts were loose, but not by much. Now, it's made of something like plastic that's molded around 4 spacers that's meant to keep it from breaking when the bolts are tightened. And on the engine side, we can still see the gasket that's still stuck to it. So here's where I make my mistake. On first appearance, the gasket is not broken, however, it's not in good condition. Now the gasket is made out of metal, but it has a layer of softer material on top of it. Well, the softer material is there to help seal against the insulator and the engine, but most of it is missing on this side. Oh, before I do go on, I did check that the bolts that hold the cylinder to the block were indeed tight. However, since the 2 bolts that were holding the insulator to the engine were a bit loose, the motion that it had was enough to disturb the softer material, and that's the reason why it had an air leak. So as you just saw, I didn't realize the extent of the damage to that gasket, so I put the insulator back on and tightened the bolts down. Now even though it was less likely to leak with the bolts tight now, there was still going to be some air leakage because of the damage to the gasket. However, as you're going to see later on, this won't have much of an impact on the blower as you would think, and the reason why might surprise you because it certainly surprised me. Now the owner didn't tell me when the exact times when the blower would have problems, but it turns out it was when the weather was cooler. So why is that important to this problem? Well, it turns out when it's cooler, the choke system is very important to getting the engine started. But with the intake leak at the insulator, it basically made the choke system not work as well as it needed to. But when it's warmer, like the day it was when I was filming this repair, the intake leak doesn't have that much of an impact on how well the choke system was working. Now since we had the carb open, we need to check and make sure that the carb isn't leaking. Now fortunately, after a couple of minutes, I don't see any gasoline coming from the carb, so we can move on. Now since we've taken care of the main problem, here's the other part that we need to look at, and it's the spark arrestor screen on the muffler. So over time, as you use a 2-stroke machine like this blower, the screen at the exhaust outlet will begin to clog up with carbon, and if it gets bad enough, it could cause running or even starting problems. Now this one is not that bad, and in fact, it's in pretty good condition for being a decade old. But since I've gotten to this point, I might as well give it a quick cleaning, that way we won't have to worry about it for another decade. So I'm using my torch to burn off the carbon from the screen, however there are other ways to clean it. So after burning off the majority of the carbon, you can use a wire brush or compressed air to get rid of the ash from the screen. After that, we can then reinstall the screen in the deflector in the muffler, which also means we can put the rear cover back on as well. So if you didn't know, the rear cover is very important to how air flows around the engine to keep it cool. So just as a reminder, do not run the blower for very long without the rear cover on. And besides that, the cover will help protect you from getting burned by covering the hot parts of the engine. The last couple of items left to do is to replace the throttle cable retainer and finally the air filter and its cover. Now I am only guessing, but I don't think this is the original air filter because it's much too nice to be as old as it is. So here's the test. Can we get the bolt to catch the nut in the air box? And with some effort, it does exactly that. So as you just saw, it didn't have any issues starting and running, and everything went according to plan. However, the next day, it was about 15 degrees cooler, and that's when it started having a tough time starting, and it was then that I realized what the issue really was. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to film the fix, which was to make a new gasket out of thick gasket paper, but it wouldn't have been that much different from what you just saw already. Just for your information, if you need to adjust the fuel delivery on this carb, you'll have to pop off a plastic cap in the middle of this brass part. Now, even though they didn't ask about it, I'm going to repair the throttle handle by reattaching it to the blower tube. Now, at first, I thought it was broken, but come to find out it was just missing a bolt, so the fix was rather simple. So what did I learn from this repair? Well, it just proves that even I make mistakes. But after realizing the mistake, I'm going to make sure that I don't make the same mistake again, and I'll do a better job of looking out for bad gaskets in the future. Also, as a tip, I would recommend that you give your intake system a good shakedown once in a while just to make sure that something like this doesn't happen to you. Now, this is not a commercial backpack blower, at least in my mind. Instead, it's a good size for residential work, but to be honest, the way that it's held up in the last 10 years was pretty amazing, and I wouldn't mind having one of these myself. And if I didn't already have a large backpack blower, I'd certainly entertain one of these in the future. So my question is, have you ever seen a machine start and run just fine in certain temperatures but not in others? And if so, what was it? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.